The sound of footsteps echoed through the concrete walls of the subway station, as if an invisible observer was repeating her every step. The girl froze, listening to the sounds around her. There was emptiness all around. Time seemed to have frozen with her, and even the bright lamps on the ceiling emitted a dim light, barely piercing the darkness. This place felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. She stood on the edge of the platform, not daring to get too close to the tracks. The cold air blew against her face, creeping under her jacket as if it foreboded something bad. All that could be heard in the distance was the occasional drip of water and the sound of the wind that had strangely broken through the depths of the dungeon. There was something about that sound. It wasn't just frightening, it awakened a primal fear in her. Her hand nervously clutched the phone in her pocket, and she checked the screen over and over, as if waiting for the message that would save her. But there was no network. She felt cut off from the world, as if everything upstairs no longer existed. And then she felt it. The look. Invisible, burning, hating. At first she'd thought it was paranoia. The gloomy place had played tricks on her imagination, but the chill that suddenly traveled down her spine was all too real. She turned around slowly. The platform was empty. Her heart beat faster when she heard footsteps again. Muffled, sure, slow. The footsteps of a predator who takes his time, knowing his prey is still in his grasp. A tall man in a policeman's uniform appeared from around the corner. His face expressed nothing but icy contempt. His eyes were piercing and empty, but behind their surface there was hatred. "Hey, what are you doing here?" His voice was low, threatening. She flinched, feeling the pressure of the words pressing against her chest, making her voice catch in her throat. I'm just waiting for the train," she squeezed out. His footsteps came closer, each one like a pain in her temples. He stopped a few paces from her, looking her over from head to toe, as if trying to find a reason to accuse her, to attack her. "This place is not for the likes of you," he hissed, drawing out each word. His hand reached for her waistband, where the gun glistened on her cold skin. She backed away instinctively, realizing he was looking for an excuse. The shadows around her seemed alive. They narrowed around her like the walls of a cell. The silence became unbearable. She realized she had to do something. But what? Run? Talk? Her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. She could feel the tension building, like a huge wave ready to crash in and swamp her forever. And then, when her desperation reached its limit, he stepped forward. His gun glinted in the light of the lamps, like a warning that the next second could be her last. His presence was overwhelming. The tall figure in his police uniform looked like part of the darkness itself. The light of the lamps seemed to bypass him, leaving his face only half lit, giving him an intimidating, almost demonic charisma. The man stood directly in front of her, unmoving, as if studying whether it was worth the effort to break her. "Where are your papers?" His voice sounded so harsh that the girl flinched, barely keeping her balance. "I don't have it with me. I was just waiting for the train," she began, trying to speak calmly, but the words gave away her fear. He grinned. That grin was full of contempt, mixed with obvious pleasure at her confusion. "Of course you have no ID. You're always undocumented, aren't you?" he said with a deliberate sneer, taking a step closer. She didn't realize what was worse in his tone, the outright threat or the affirmative contempt with which he spoke of people like her. "I didn't do anything." Her voice shook, and she took a step back, feeling the cold of the concrete hit her heels. "And that's for me to decide, not you," he hissed, slowly raising his hand and pointing to the floor beside him. Down. Hands behind your head. The girl looked at him confusedly, not believing that this was really happening. But his eyes were as cold as steel. He didn't expect excuses. He was expecting obedience. Don't make me say it again. We both know you're the kind of guy who's always hiding something. He slowly raised his hand to his belt, where the gun was already, and his fingers touched the grip. Her heart pounded frantically, tearing in her chest. For a second, she wanted to scream, to call for help, but common sense reminded her that no one would hear. Here, in this dungeon, she was alone. How many tickets you got, huh? Or maybe you've been stealing. Violated? He continued his attacks, now making them as humiliating as possible. His words seemed to sink into her, shattering what little self-control she had left. I didn't. She tried again, but he interrupted her sharply. Shut up! He shouted so loudly that she was instinctively shaken. He leaned closer, his face so close she could smell the tobacco odor coming from his form. He spoke more softly, but each phrase sounded like a sentence. Do you know what they do to you if you resist? You think someone up there is going to feel sorry for another victim of the system? No, baby. They don't pity people like you. You're nothing. Those words, poisoned with hatred, seemed to punch a hole in her soul. She felt tiny, helpless, and cornered. All right, get on your knees. I'm going to check what you're carrying. Or should I search you right away? Maybe we'll find something interesting. His voice was both cruel and almost amused. She felt like she was going to pass out a little more. His gun glinted in the light of the lamps as he put his hand on the holster. And in that moment, she realized he's not just threatening. He enjoys it. He enjoys her fear, her humiliation. But even deeper than that, she knew another thing. He was looking for an excuse to pull a weapon, an excuse to use it. Her fingers trembled as she slowly sank to her knees, but inside her everything was screaming. She had to do something, had to fight back. But how? Her thoughts were chaotic and fear was tearing them apart. Seconds seemed like an eternity as she felt the policeman getting closer and closer. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether something like this has happened to you in your life. Your answers help us understand how important topics like this are. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so you don't miss our new stories. And now we continue. The policeman looked down at her as if gauging her reaction, savoring every second of her fear. She watched his hand slide slowly toward the gun, as if he were stalling for time, stretching out this moment. The click of the holster buckle sounded like a gunshot, and her heart skipped a beat. He drew his weapon. His movement was smooth, almost lazy, but each moment seemed like an eternity. The girl couldn't take her eyes off the cold shine of the metal that now separated them like an invisible line. He held the gun in his hand, not as a tool, but as a symbol of absolute power. "Are you scared?" he asked, the corners of his mouth curving slightly into a subtle grin. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice froze somewhere in her chest, where only heavy, ragged breaths came from. "Of course you are," he continued, stepping closer. "People like you are always afraid when they face real power. You used to think you could do whatever you wanted, didn't you? You think the laws are the same for everyone, don't you?" He weighed the gun in his hand as if testing its weight, though the girl realized it was an act. He was enjoying her fear. His gestures were aimed not at action, but at breaking her from the inside. I see you're not talking. It's the right thing to do. It's the only thing left for you to do." His tone became lower, drawn out. He raised the gun slowly, aiming it in her direction. "Tell me what you're doing here, and don't lie. One wrong word, and it will be the last thing you say." The girl swallowed convulsively, trying to find the words. I was just waiting for the train." Her voice was barely audible and her gaze was fixed on the muzzle of the gun. "Train, huh? Of course it is. Why don't you also say you're here by accident?" He moved closer, his boots sounding heavy on the floor. The gun in his hand moved slowly, describing semicircles as if encompassing her space. "Minus I didn't do anything." She knew she was repeating the same thing, but fear blocked out all other words. "And that's not for you to decide, okay?" He took a sharp step forward, the gun now a few centimeters from her face. "You think your skin color is an excuse? You think people like me should bow down to you, turn a blind eye to your existence?" Those words hit harder than any physical blow. She felt his hatred pressing against her, crushing her will. He stepped even closer, his face now almost right up to hers. "You know why you're all like you? Because you used to think you had rights, that you'll be protected. But guess what? There's no one here in this subway, and no one will come even if you scream." The girl felt a chill run down her spine. He was right. The subway was deserted. No one would come to help her. "So I ask the questions, you answer. And if you say one word I don't like—" He twirled the gun in his hand as if considering where best to point the muzzle. "You'll know what it's like to be nothing." She tried to breathe evenly, though fear clutched her chest with a steely grip. His voice continued, his words like whiplash, each phrase degrading to her dignity. "Look how weak you are. Look at you, standing there, shaking, and you think someone upstairs is going to care if you disappear? No, baby. Nobody cares about you. You're just trash." Her body trembled. She didn't know what was scarier, the weapon in his hand or the words that were tearing her up inside. But she knew one thing. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't stop until he'd broken her completely, until he'd squeezed all the strength out of her. Silence covered the station again, but now it was a silence of terror that filled everything around it. Only one word was beating in the girl's mind. Salvation. But there was no sign of him. The policeman stood in front of her, his gun flickering in the dim light of the lamps, his voice cut in the air like a knife. Each word penetrated deeper, making her feel insignificant, helpless. "You realize you have no way out, don't you?" he said, tilting his head to the side as if he were talking to an animal. "You think someone's gonna come?" "No one. Never." Her breathing became heavy, her eyes darting around the station, looking for the slightest chance. She noticed his attention falter slightly as he took a step back as he continued to speak. And then an idea broke through the chaos of her fear. The phone. Her hands shook like a leaf in the wind as she fumbled for the device in her pocket. She knew she only had a few seconds. If he noticed, she couldn't escape. "It's amazing how you people like you always think life isn't fair to you. You complain about the system, and yet you're the one standing there, afraid to even breathe." "Typical," he continued, turning away to look at the platform. In that brief second, she pulled out her phone. The screen flashed, illuminating her face, but she quickly set it down so the light wouldn't give her away. Her fingers could barely move, fear stiffening every muscle. "Urgent! Subway station, he's armed. Please, Dad." The text was short, but it seemed to her that it took forever to type it. A mistake could cost her her life. Her father was her only hope. She knew he was somewhere nearby in his secret job, only he could understand how to act in a situation like this. "Hey!" the policeman shouted loudly, and her heart sank. He turned to her, his eyes instantly noticing the phone in her hand. "What's that you got there?" She didn't have time to hit send. Panic overwhelmed her, but she forced herself to grit her teeth and answer. "Yeah, I just, wanted to call." Her voice shook, and fear was in every word. "Give it here," he ordered, his tone turning icy. She pretended to reach for it as if in submission, but her thumb quickly hit the send button. The message was gone before he snatched the phone out of her hands. He looked at the screen, frowning, then back at her. His face contorted in anger. "Did you decide to call for help?" He stepped toward her, waving the phone threateningly. "Did someone like you think you could fool me?" She backed away until her back was against the cold concrete wall. He loomed over her, his gun back between them. "You think your daddy's gonna save you? I'll tell you something, this place is my territory. I'm the law. And even if someone comes, it's gonna look like it was your fault. You understand?" She knew. She understood that this man would stop at nothing to show his power. Her hope was thinner than a thread, but she knew one thing. Her father would not abandon her. If he saw the message, he would do anything to save her. As he spoke, only one thought echoed in her mind. Will he make it? The girl's father was sitting in a dark corner of a small apartment set up as a temporary base of operations. A map of the city was spread out on the table in front of him, and the screen of a laptop with encrypted messages flashed in the corner. He was focused, as he always was during missions, his thoughts revolving around the next target, until the phone in his pocket vibrated. He pulled it out momentarily, expecting another instruction from his superiors, but when a message from his daughter popped up on the screen, his heart sank. "Urgent! Subway station, he's armed. Please, Dad." Those few words pierced him like a knife. He'd been trained to deal with danger, but not the kind that involved his family. The training, the missions, the hostage rescues, none of it ever touched what he truly cared about. His daughter. He jumped up from his seat, grabbing his jacket and checking the weapon on his belt. His brain began to quickly formulate a plan. A map of the subway instantly appeared in his mind. All the routes, exits, hiding places, he knew every second counted. On his way down the stairs, he called a CIA contact. "I need access to the subway station cameras on line 3. "Urgent." His voice sounded like a command, not a request. "What happened?" the operator asked. "A personal situation. Don't ask questions, just give me the cameras." His tone was harsh enough that there were no more questions. Already in the car, he tapped into the system and saw an image of the station. The cameras showed his daughter standing against the wall. In front of her was a policeman holding a gun. The father instantly recognized that look, that facial expression. He had seen men like that dozens of times, men who used power to suppress and destroy, men who relished the fear of others. His fists clenched on the steering wheel. This man wasn't just a threat. He was a predator, and Dad knew he couldn't hesitate to deal with one. "Damn it," he muttered, swerving sharply away from the traffic and pushing the gas pedal to the limit. His daughter's voice rang in his head, her weak, frightened words that he'd heard hours ago on the phone. At the time, he'd thought it was just teenage nervousness, some frivolous incident. He'd made a mistake, and that mistake might have cost her her life. In his mind, he went back to the past. to training, to secret missions, to surviving, to staying one step ahead of the enemy. It all seemed like a game compared to this moment. This wasn't an operation. This was his daughter. As he approached the station, thoughts of race, of the hatred that was eating away at the system, began to weigh on him harder. This policeman represented everything he had fought against his entire career: the injustice, the hatred, the abuse of power. He knew this man wouldn't stop unless he was stopped. His car stopped with a screech of tires in front of the subway entrance. He jumped out, weapon ready. Years of training had allowed him to maintain absolute coolness, but inside he was torn. As he descended the stairs, he could hear the echo of his footsteps. The dungeon seemed more sinister to him than ever. Each step brought him closer to the moment of truth. He didn't know how it would end, but one thing was certain: he would do anything to save her. As he approached the platform, he slowed, hiding in the shadows. His gaze instantly snatched up the scene: his daughter slumped against the wall, and a policeman standing in front of her with a gun. The father took a deep breath, concentrating. His training had saved lives more than once, but now he was fighting for his family. "Time is running out," he muttered to himself as he took the first step toward the enemy. My father pressed the gas pedal to the floor. His car howled, struggling to squeeze between the traffic. The red and yellow lights on the traffic lights flashed, but he didn't pay attention to them anymore. Time was passing too fast, and every second brought his daughter closer to the edge of the abyss. The traffic in the city was dense, as if the world were slowing down on purpose, testing his patience. The cars stretched in an endless column as he maneuvered between them, ignoring the honking horns and angry looks of the drivers. His thoughts were fixed on one thing: his daughter, facing the weapon in the monster's hands. Meanwhile, at the subway station, the inferno continued. The policeman circled around the girl like a predator, waiting for the moment to strike the final blow. His words were venomous, each phrase like a blade cutting through her composure. "Look at you," he said with a chuckle, pointing the gun directly at her chest. "Weak, cowardly, pathetic. People like you always look like that when they're alone. Where are your big slogans now, huh? Where's your pride?" His words came out like gravel, painful and humiliating. She clenched her hands into fists, trying not to look at him, not to show the tears that stung her eyes. "No one will stand up for you. No one will even notice if you're gone. Aren't you used to being a statistic?" The girl felt her legs shaking, but she forced herself to stand. She knew her father was close somewhere. He had to be close. Meanwhile, in the car, my father had managed to pull into the main street leading to the station. He turned on the siren, which he used only in emergencies. The siren cut through the air, forcing the cars to move apart. "Hold on, girl, hold on," he muttered through clenched teeth. Images of his daughter flashed through his mind: her smile, her voice, her laughter. But those memories blended with what he saw on the camera screen: the frightened eyes, the trembling hands, the policeman looming over her. At the station, the policeman stepped closer, his gun now almost touching her. He spoke slowly, with poisoned confidence. "You know what the funny thing is? I could fire a shot and no one would ask questions. It'd be self-defense, you know? Everybody's gonna believe me, because I'm the law. And you're just a freak of nature." Those words pierced her like a knife. She felt that she had no strength left to fight. Fear gripped her whole being, but somewhere deep inside, a tiny flame of hope flared. Her father jumped out of the car, leaving her on the curb. He sped toward the subway entrance, almost knocking people down the stairs. As he went downstairs, he could hear his breathing, rumbling like a drumbeat. He forced himself to focus, mapping out a plan in his head. When he reached the platform, he slowed his step so as not to give away his presence. His eyes snatched up the scene. His daughter stood huddled against the wall, and in front of her, just a few feet away, a policeman held a gun. Every muscle in his body tensed. He knew he had no margin for error. One wrong step, one wrong move, and he could lose her forever. The only thought in his head was, I have to make it in time. I have to save her. Let's pause for one more brief pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you have faced similar situations in your life. Your feedback is important to us. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. The station platform was immersed in the cold light of the dim lamps. The silence of the underground was broken only by the echo of the girl's heavy breathing and the slow, measured voice of the policeman, who enjoyed every second of her fear. That's it. Stay where you are. His voice was full of sinister satisfaction, as if he had already won. You realize you're nothing, don't you? Your place is in the dirt, down below our feet. You should all know that. The girl stood slumped against the wall. Her legs barely held her up, but fear kept her from falling. The gun in his hands was pointed directly at her breasts, and his finger on the trigger trembled to the rhythm of his own arousal. Her mind screamed that it was over, but somewhere deep inside, a tiny shard of faith remained. Her father was coming. Meanwhile, in the darkness of the platform a few meters away from what was happening, her father was slowly moving forward, taking cover behind concrete columns. He heard everything. Every humiliating word from the policeman sounded like a challenge. His fists clenched with rage, but he kept himself under control. Impulsiveness could kill her. What was needed here was cold-blooded calculation. He quickly assessed the situation. The policeman focused on the girl, gun at the ready. A direct attack would result in a gunshot. We had to distract him, make him lose control. You ready, girl? The policeman squinted, pointing the gun a little higher, right in the girl's face. You think that look's gonna stop me? I've seen hundreds like you. You're one of the ones who think she's got rights. And now you're about to find out what it's like to be nothing. The finger on the trigger began to slowly flex. At that moment, her father's voice cut through the silence like a lightning strike. Hey, put the gun down. The policeman twitched, turning instantly at the sound. His eyes met those of a man who was staring at him with cold, deadly certainty. The policeman's hand trembled, but he didn't lower his weapon. It's none of your business, buddy, he snapped, shifting his gaze between the man and the girl. Get out of here. That's my authority. You've already violated all your powers. My father took a step forward, showing no fear. There was a gun in his hand, but he didn't point it. He knew that every move now mattered. And I won't let you make another mistake. Who the hell are you? The policeman hummed, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. What are you doing here? Protecting this? He paused, dazed for a moment, then added with a chuckle, Her daddy, huh? Well, this is going to be fun. Yes, I'm her father, he answered firmly. And you're a man with a gun in your hand, breaking the law. Do you think this will end well for you? Nobody's going to stop me, shouted the policeman, pointing his gun now at the man. You think you're going to make a difference? You're all the same. You think the world isn't fair to you. Well, let me tell you, you don't deserve justice. The father realized that the policeman was on edge. He had seen it before, in people who were broken by their own hatred. This man wanted to shoot, not because he needed to, but because he needed to feel power. "You don't know anything about us," my father said quietly, taking another step forward. They were only a few meters apart now. "But you're about to find out what it means to meet someone who will do anything to protect his family." The policeman froze. He was ready to pull the trigger, but his hesitation became visible. The man didn't look scared. More than that, he looked dangerous. "Get out!" he shouted, but his voice trembled. The father took advantage of the moment and quickly raised his weapon, pointing it precisely at the policeman's shoulder. "This is your last chance. Drop the gun, or I'll make you do it." The policeman twitched, trying to aim, but his father fired first. A loud pop echoed through the station. The bullet pierced the policeman's shoulder, forcing him to release the gun. He fell to the floor, screaming in pain. A moment later, the father rushed to his daughter, covering her with himself. She sobbed, clutching at him, her hands shaking. "It's over, sweetheart," he whispered, though he knew it was only the beginning. The policeman collapsed to his knees, his hand clutching his shoulder, blood trickling from it. His face was contorted with pain, but the rage in his eyes was still there. This was a man who didn't know defeat, or didn't want to admit it. Even now, wounded, he was still a threat. The father stood between him and his daughter, still holding the gun at the ready. His breathing was heavy, but his gaze remained cold and focused. "Stay where you are," he ordered, his voice sounding like a roll of thunder in the empty subway. But the policeman only smirked, writhing in pain. "You think this is the end? You and your girl are going to get out of here?" He raised his head slowly, his voice soaked with hatred. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "Shut up," my father said, gripping the gun tighter. "One more move and you won't get up." The policeman raised his hand slowly, as if in surrender, but his gaze betrayed a different intent. He slid his eyes across the platform, considering his options. Father sensed it. He knew that look, the same look he'd seen in terrorists, criminals, people willing to die to take someone with them. Suddenly, the policeman rushed towards the weapon that was lying a few meters away from him. The movement was sharp and sudden. The father managed to fire, but his bullet hit the floor close to the target. The policeman rolled over, grabbed his gun, and opened fire. The echo of gunfire filled the dungeon. The girl screamed and her father pushed her aside, sheltering her behind a concrete column. He himself remained standing in the open, knowing that retreating would give the enemy an advantage. "You think you're a hero," shouted the policeman, firing blindly, bullets clinking against concrete and metal. "You're just like the rest of them. You think your rules work? This world belongs to us, not you." Father quietly made his way along the columns, approaching the policeman. Every step was calculated, every movement calibrated. His mind fought his instincts. He didn't want to kill. This was not a war, and this man was not an enemy that could simply be eliminated. But if he made a mistake, his daughter would die. The policeman, breathing heavily, changed position. His bleeding wound was slowing him down, but he wouldn't give up. His hatred fueled him, making him more dangerous than ever. "You know what the funny thing is?" he continued, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. "Even if you kill me, you lose. The system will crush you. You'll be an outcast like your girl." Dad froze behind another column, his gun ready. He took a deep breath, concentrating. This was the moment of truth. He took a step forward, firing a shot in the cop's direction. The bullet hit him in the thigh, sending him to the ground. The man screamed in pain, but he still wouldn't let go of the weapon. His fingers were shaking, but he was still trying to aim. The father stepped closer, aiming directly at the policeman's chest. "It's over," he said, but his voice was full of doubt. "You won't shoot," the cop hissed, grinning through the pain. "You think you're better than me? You're just a murderer hiding behind your heroism. Go ahead, shoot, do it." His father stared at him. His fingers tensed, but he didn't pull the trigger. In that moment, he remembered everything. His daughter, her voice, her fear. This man deserved to be punished, but he couldn't become like him. He took a step back, lowering the gun. "You're not worth it," he said, his voice quiet but determined. The policeman tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. He fell back to the floor, his breathing becoming hoarse. The father turned to his daughter. She was still sitting against the column, her face pale and her eyes full of terror. He went to her, lifted her to her feet, and hugged her tightly. "It's over," he whispered. But deep down, he knew. This was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new battle. Against the system, against injustice, against those who believe their hatred can rule the world. They walked out of the subway together, leaving the bloody platform behind them. However, every minute they spent together was now worth more than ever. The price of freedom was too high. A day that started with an ordinary wait for a train ended with a nightmare that changed their lives forever. The girl sat on the bed in her room, wrapping her arms around herself. The light from the desk lamp was soft, but seemed too bright for her reddened, swollen eyes. It was raining outside, the drops tapping against the glass, but the sound was not comforting. The father stood in the doorway, his shadow falling on the wall. He stared at his daughter, guilt gnawing at him from the inside out. All his training, his skills, the dozens of operations he'd performed in the most dangerous places in the world suddenly seemed useless. He couldn't protect her from what was closest to home. "Daddy," she said quietly, not turning around. Her voice was weak, almost a whisper. Why did he do it? The question hit him harder than the bullets he'd faced on missions. He walked slowly over and sat down next to her. "Some people," he began, struggling to find the words. They see the world through the lens of hate. They need to feel stronger, better than someone else. This isn't about you. It's about him." She was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. "But why me?" Her voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes again. "Why is it always someone like us?" He realized he didn't have the answer to that question. She was right. The system, society, it was all imbued with a bias that had poisoned the lives of millions for centuries. "It's not your fault," he said, putting his hand on her shoulder. "Don't ever think like that. It's not because of who you are. It's because of who he was." But his words sounded hollow. He could see it in her eyes. They couldn't erase the horror she'd experienced. He remembered the way her shaking body clung to him as he led her out of the subway. He remembered the look in her eyes, full of fear and pain as the cop collapsed to the floor, wounded but still full of hate. The father stood up, his face stony, but inside he felt anger tearing him apart. This wasn't the first time he had faced injustice, but it was the first time it had touched his daughter, his family, and, for the first time, he felt powerless. The next day, he went to the police station. The officers of the Internal Investigation Department had already started working on his statement. He described everything: the policeman's actions, his words, his hatred, but the faces of the officers who listened to him expressed little more than indifference. "We'll check into the case," he was told on the way out. "But, it could have just been, stress at work. We shouldn't jump to conclusions." He stood in front of the building, clenching his fists. The words, "stress at work," sounded like an insult. His daughter could die, and the system was ready to justify the aggressor. When he returned home, he found her sitting in the kitchen. She was silent, but her eyes, deep and dark, now seemed wan. "We will fight," he said firmly. She looked at him, and in her gaze she read the question, "What difference will it make?" "Do you want it to happen again to someone else?" he asked. Her face trembled and she looked away. "I just wish it wouldn't happen," she whispered. The phrase echoed in his head as he sat in his office late at night. In front of him were the papers he had gathered to file a formal complaint and the photo files of the very police officer he had found through his connections. He knew that justice would have to be ripped out of the system from the root, and it would be a long, dirty fight. But it wasn't just the system that bothered him. His daughter had changed. Her joy, her laughter, her bright energy, all of it was gone, leaving silence and pain in its place. Every time she passed the mirror, he saw her avoid her reflection, as if she didn't want to look at the person she had become after that night. "We can handle it," he said to himself, looking at the papers in front of him. But inside he realized this fight would not end tomorrow, and the price of this freedom was already too high. Time passed. 1 week flowed into the next, but the tension in the house did not abate. After that night, something subtly changed between father and daughter. They no longer spoke directly about what had happened, avoiding mentioning the subway, the cop, the gun, or even the word fear. But each silence grew louder and louder, as if an invisible barrier was pulling them apart. The girl tried to get back to normal. She went to school again, sat with her friends, pretended that everything was fine. But even in her brightest moments, her eyes remained empty. Sometimes she felt like the shadows of that subway now followed her everywhere. Footsteps in the street, loud voices, even the casual glances of strangers, all of it made her flinch. She'd tried talking to the psychologist her father had hired, but the sessions had been of little use. How could she explain pain to someone who had never looked hate in the face, so close she could feel its breath? "It just stays with me," she said quietly in one of her sessions when asked how she copes with the memories. "There's nothing I can do." The father, on the other hand, threw himself into the fight against the system. His complaint triggered a wave of proceedings, but the result was predictable. The case was hushed up. The policeman injured that night was reassigned to an administrative position. No one found him guilty. No one questioned what had happened at the station. "We don't have enough evidence," the station told him. "You have a witness," he insisted. "Your daughter?" answered him with a slight chuckle. "She is not an objective source." Every word, every answer only made him feel more helpless. He had been fighting all his life, but this battle was the most exhausting. Because what was at stake was not just the truth, but his daughter's future. One evening, they were sitting in the kitchen. The table between them was littered with cups of cooled tea. They were both silent. "You did your best," she finally said, breaking the silence. His eyes rose to her face. "It's not enough," he replied. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his mind. "You can't change everything," she said quietly. It's just too big." I can't help trying, he answered. His voice was firm, but his gaze betrayed a weariness that grew every day. And then what? She spoke bitterly. You're gonna get him fired, and someone else will take his place. Nothing will change. He lowered his head. He knew she was right. One man couldn't destroy a system that had been built over decades. He couldn't erase the hatred that was embedded in the roots of society. But I can show you that we don't give up, he said after a long pause. I can show you that there are people who fight, who are not silent. This is not the end, you know? She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time her gaze softened. Sometimes it seems better to just forget, she said. He shook his head. Oblivion is what they want. His voice became harsh. If you forget, if I forget, if we all forget, they win, and I can't let that happen. At night, when the house was silent, she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. His words rang in her ears, but with them came the words of the policeman. You're nothing. Those words stayed in her mind like a stigma, like a scar she couldn't erase. Her father sat in his office, once again studying documents and gathering evidence. He knew that this battle would not bring him immediate victory, but he also knew that there was no stopping. The next morning, they met in the hallway. She looked tired but determined. You're right, she said. We can't forget. He looked at her, his heart clenched. She was still so young, but life had already dealt her its blows. I'll always be there for you, he said. They embraced, and in that moment there was silence, but not peace. It was a union two people who understood that wounds would never fully heal, but that it was possible to live with them. The story did not have a happy ending. The hatred continued, and the system remained unchanged. But there was a point to the story. The realization that the struggle is not always a victory, but it is always a choice. A choice not to be silent, not to forget, not to give up. Though their wounds remained open, they knew they were not alone in this struggle. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories and opinions are very important to us. We appreciate each of you and your support. Subscribe to our channel to not miss new stories, and don't forget to give us a like. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul.